Hello and welcome to Intro to Mass Communication. I am Cyrus Satzes, and for this week, we're going to be covering the subject of media and culture. So why don't I share my screen first and quickly go to my web browser before we get going, just to introduce you to our textbook, which is what each of these lectures are largely based on. And of course, I add additional content based on other scholarly research, anecdotal evidence based on my own media experience. But largely, the content of all these recordings and all these lectures are based largely on the textbook Understanding Media and Culture, which again is free to you. And I strongly recommend, if you decide to download the book, to download the digital PDF version, because you can click on each individual chapter and skip right to it. Whereas if you download the print PDF, you have to scroll all the way to each individual chapter. And I'm honestly not familiar with these other formats. So that is entirely your call. So let me now go to the PowerPoint lecture, which is going to accompany the vast majority of these. Here we go. So we're going to be talking about media and culture today. Now, again, research has shown that when it comes to online learning and video lectures, 5 to 15 minutes is the ideal time for each student before they start to tune out or become disinterested. So at any point, if you start to space out, at any point, if you find yourself losing interest, take a break, go do something else, recharge, and then come back and continue watching this later. So again, we're going to start this class. This is the first actual lecture of the course, and we're again talking about media and culture. And we're going to start with definitions. There are a few very important terms here. The first one is mass communication, and the definition of that concept is information transmitted to large segments of the population. So when you talk about mass communicating, it is not interpersonal communication where you're having, let's say, like a one-on-one communication with someone else. This is where you are transmitting and disseminating information to large groups. There is no set measurement for what defines mass, but typically 1,000 or more is what scholars or what professionals base it on, although again, that number is subjective itself. Now, mass media is different than mass communication. The definition of mass media is a means of communication that is designed to reach a wide audience. So in order to mass communicate, you need mass media as a platform to send out your message, okay? So again, mass communication is the information that's transmitted to large segments of the population, and the act of doing so. Mass media is the means of doing so, the how of mass communicating. And we'll cover a lot of examples of that in the lectures to come. And then the definition of culture from the textbook is the shared values, attitudes, beliefs, and practices that characterize a social group, organization, or institution. So for this class, for example, you're studying mass communication based on United States standards. Now, the culture of this country is obviously very different than other countries in the world. The First Amendment, for example, grants freedom of the press. That may or may not be the case with a lot of other countries in the world. And free speech is a concept and a right that we enjoy here in the United States that is not enjoyed in most other countries in the world. So when we talk about culture, you can start on a macro scale there, and on a micro scale, there are a lot of cultures just here within the United States, and you'll understand the relevance and importance of that as we continue on. Now, what does the media do for us, right? Like, why does it even exist? Well, it entertains, right? Especially in this day and age, we need forms of entertainment. We need a respite from the stress of life. And so the media oftentimes serves as a form of entertainment. It also informs and educates us, right? And that's really where the fundamental premise of the press in the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment is based on. In order for us to be an informed citizenry, to go into the ballot box and actually vote on an educated level, we need to be informed. And that's what we rely on the media and the press for, is to inform us so that we make educated decisions when it comes time for voting, whether it's for politicians or for legislation. It's also a public forum for discussion of important issues. In the modern era, something like, for example, Nextdoor is considered media, right? The comment sections for a section of a website could be a public forum. Obviously, discussion forum pages themselves. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do that. Reddit would be a great example for that. Really, the whole internet serves that purpose. But in my humble opinion, the most important role of the media is the watchdog role. In other words, without the press, we don't have a free democratic society because we are not informed on what powerful institutions like the government or big business are doing. And the founding fathers, way ahead of their time back in the 1700s, realized the importance of the press in terms of informing the citizens, informing the sovereignty of what the powers that be are doing. And again, when we talk about what's powerful, we're referring primarily to, again, big government and big business, because those are really the two most powerful institutions here in the United States. And so the press serves as a watchdog role. In other words, whereas the three branches of government, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch serve as a checks and balances on each other, the press serves as a checks and balance on those three branches by informing the public in terms of what they are doing. So and then that's really again, in my opinion, what the most important role of the press is to serve as a watchdog over major powerful institutions and organizations. Now, the textbook in chapter 1 talks about the history of mass media and culture and how it started. And mass communication was not even really something that existed until the printing press was invented, right? And Gutenberg in the 15th century invented the movable type printing press. That still did not print fast, but at least with the printing press, you were able to see the mass production of books. You were able to see newspapers mass produced, but again, it was at a very slow rate. Then in 1810, Frederick Koenig hooked a steam engine up to the printing press, and that's really where the dawn of the modern newspaper emerged, because now the printing press not only moved fast, you had higher circulation speeds, you had larger distribution at that point, and this is really where mass communication started to explode and become a thing, right? Because now suddenly people were getting informed on sometimes a daily basis, whereas before they were never informed like that. The textbook covers that more in detail. Then in the 1830s, that gave rise again to newspapers as the printing press evolved in terms of technology. It also gave rise to the penny press, which was called that because it was literally cost a penny. The New York Herald here, this picture, and this was taken from the textbook, is an example of the penny press. And the penny press back in those days was not like sensationalized media is today, where today it's like more tabloid style, you focus on celebrities and so forth. Back then, what they considered to be sensationalized news was like crime stories, murder stories, because they were considered to be relatively obscene, and a lot of people just couldn't handle that kind of serious news. Obviously, things have changed. And then in the early 20th century, the radio emerged, and the radio was the first time people were able to consume information instantaneously, right? So mass communication suddenly didn't need to wait a day for the newspaper to be processed, printed, distributed. Now that information was immediate. And so radio was a huge invention and a huge innovation for society in terms of the dissemination and consumption of information. And then we skip ahead, and again, the textbook has more details on this, so again, please read the textbook. I'm summarizing for your classroom studies what the most important parts of the textbook are. So fast forward now, so the radio has been around. We skip past World War II. Where suddenly in the United States, there was a lot of prosperity, especially financially, and the television emerged, right? Which actually was a visual medium. So you got your information and your content instantaneously like radio, only there was now a visual component to it. In 1946, about 17,000 television sets existed in the United States. And within 7 years, fast forward to 1953, 2/3 of all American households owned at least one TV set. This was rapid, innovative technology. And by 1975, The three major television networks, which we'll cover later in the semester in the TV section, accounted for 93% of all television viewing. So back then, when we talk about some of the theories in mass communication, like gatekeeping, for example, which I'll talk about in a moment, there were very few entities that controlled so much of the information we all consume, right? So it was just literally these three major networks, again, accounted for 93% of all the television viewing. You had radio stations, you had newspapers, maybe you had books. People weren't really going to movie theaters at this point to consume information. They're mostly going for entertainment purposes. But in the 1970s, there were very few individuals or organizations that we call the gatekeepers, because they decided what information the public consumed, and they wielded an enormous amount of power. But as you know, as the media has risen and there has been more and more sources of information, the three major networks, in this case referring to CBS, NBC, ABC, had whittled in terms of their influence and power. By 2004, this share had dropped to 28.4%. Still a very large number, though, and the three major networks still wield an enormous amount of power in terms of influence and audience size. The textbook talks about the concept of media convergence. This is the process by which previously distinct technologies come to share tasks and resources, right? These include economic convergence, and an economic convergence in media refers to, for example, a media conglomerate. Disney would be the best example of that. They own, besides theme parks where they convey messages there themselves, they own film studios, they own television networks. I believe they own TV stations, numerous websites. So that's one example of of economic convergence, is a media conglomerate. Organic convergence is something you do yourself, like live tweeting would be an example of that, right? You're watching and consuming information from a television set, or maybe from one computer, and you're using your mobile device, another component, another variable, to send out your version of that information, right? So you're converging multiple medias at that point, organically in this case. There's an example of cultural convergence, right? Where, for example, Star Wars, which is owned, funny enough, by the same Disney company I mentioned a moment ago. Star Wars can be a movie, can be a TV show. We got the Boba Fett series going on right now. They have a lot of video games. They have theme park rides. So that's a cultural convergence, where Star Wars, for example, is consumed through a wide variety of channels. And then there's global convergence, this is more obscure, but a remake of a foreign film will be an example of that. And I believe the textbook uses the movie Vanilla Sky as an example. This was originally a Spanish film that was then remade in the United States, and the US version starred Tom Cruise. Interestingly enough, Penelope Cruz was an actress in both films. But that is an example of global convergence, where the same film that started in Spain is now remade here in the United States. And then there's technological convergence, the iPhone being the best example of that, since the iPhone, just by itself, this little device can serve as a radio. Whether you're listening to podcasts or live streaming radio, you can watch videos, you can read stories, you can produce content. Really one of the more amazing, fascinating inventions of our time. Now, the importance of culture is especially applicable to free speech and its limitations. And this is a huge reason why the textbook talks about culture when it comes to mass communication. So the First Amendment of the US Constitution grants and guarantees freedom of the press. Vitally important freedom for a free democratic society like ours, because again, as I talked about just a few moments ago, if we don't know what the most powerful individuals and groups in this country are doing, then we are uninformed when it comes time to vote. And you need to be informed so you understand what individual candidates stand for in terms of issues. You need to understand what certain bonds you might, or certain measures you might vote for, what they represent. If you don't have a press informing you, you don't know what it is you're exactly voting for, and the whole premise of voting is moot and irrelevant at that point. So the press is vitally important, right? But not everything is covered and protected in the First Amendment. One of those is obscenity. That is not protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled that, and they also ruled that it is defined by community standards. So what might seem obscene, for example, in Texas, might not seem so obscene in California, right? So that is especially where community is important and culture is important, because culture and community do tie in together. Copyright law is another thing that is not protected by the First Amendment. You cannot copy and use someone else's work as your own. That does not constitute free speech. And then the textbook covers what is a very important topic that we're going to be covering throughout the semester, and that is propaganda. Excuse me. Propaganda is communication that intentionally attempts to persuade its audience for ideological, political, or commercial purposes. So until World War II, mass communication and journalism were not necessarily scholarly fields of research. Prior to World War II, basically, if you wanted to be a journalist, you get your bachelor's degree at a J school and you study journalism. You learn about objectivity and subjectivity. You learn about maybe AP style of writing. You learn how to find sources. You learn how to be a good writer and a good storyteller. But that was the extent of it. There wasn't much in terms of theoretical applications. There wasn't much complexity in terms of the production of news stories. But then a certain individual named Adolf Hitler led a rising of his political group and eventually led a nation, and committed obviously atrocities that I think most of you know about. But he needed a country to support him for all these ridiculous, asinine, deplorable decisions that he made. And so he convinced the country of Germany to support him through propaganda, through messages that would persuade the audience to believe him and to support him. And this gained the attention of two groups in academia, those who studied psychology and psychiatry, and sociologists. The psychiatry side of it was fascinated because they were wondering, how exactly do propagandic messages actually influence people? Like, how are people believing content that is or is not true? And then sociologists were fascinated because they were wondering what the impact of potential lies and mistruths and factual inaccuracies would have on a society as a whole, and thus gave rise to mass communication and journalism as a scholarly field of research, because through propaganda, there is constant research going on in terms of the power and influence of the media and how it affects society as a whole. And these are some examples of propaganda right here. Uncle Sam recruiting people for the army. This is an example of a poster during Hitler's Nazi Germany. Notice how he's holding a baby. He looks charming. He looks appealing. And that is literally the definition of propaganda. And then the US government, again, and this was during World War II, showing a picture of Hitler basically insinuating that if Americans are lazy and don't fight, he's going to win, right? And this was a propagandic means of recruitment for service to the country. And obviously, there's a lot of propaganda in today's world that is very different from that. And if you're watching this video and you're part of my class, you will certainly be learning much more about that. Now, I talked about gatekeeping theory a moment ago. Now, gatekeeping theory is defined scholarly as forces which may either constrain or facilitate the passage of news items through what's called the gatekeeping process. In layman's terms, the mass media whittles that a large number of available messages that could be produced as stories into the select few that are actually offered to an audience. The gatekeepers decide what is considered newsworthy, right? And these individuals are called gatekeepers. And they could be individuals, they could be organizations, they could be entities. This chart, for example, and this is old, I'm going to show you a more modern version in just a second, but this is an example of gatekeeping, right? And this is also an example of media convergence, where one organization controls a lot of different smaller media organizations. I'm going to show you this chart. This is more modern. It's still missing numerous organizations like Twitter, for example. Facebook is not on here, for example. I don't know if Netflix is on here. BuzzFeed should be on here because they own the Huffington Post and they are a news source themselves. But in general, this chart should show you that the vast majority of the information we consume as a society is controlled by a handful of corporations. I mean, there are not a lot of bubbles here that represent sources of media content. And not all of these are even news sources for that matter. Some of these are strictly entertainment. So it's important to be aware of the fact that the information that you consume that helps you decide what you call reality in the world around you, because you can't be everywhere all the time, is produced and distributed to you through just a handful of organizations, which is why I always maintain that it's okay to be skeptical of the information you consume. That is healthy. Skepticism is very healthy. Cynicism is unhealthy. Okay, because if you're cynical, that means in your mind, everything is not true. There's a hidden agenda. There's a deep state. Someone's out to get you. It represents paranoia. It represents a complete detachment from reality. So what I always try to promote is skepticism is healthy. Question the information you get and make sure it is valid. Don't be cynical where you think everything is invalid except for maybe what you personally believe in. That is cynicism, and that is not healthy. So I always ask this of everyone, whether it's in a classroom or in general, to get a better grasp of what gatekeeping theory is, right? As I start by asking who the gatekeepers of information were before the internet emerged, right? And this is in 1995 is the year where the internet really started to explode in terms of wide use and information consumption. But before the internet, it was fairly black and white in terms of who the gatekeepers were, right? These included editors. Could be of a newspaper, could be of a book, executive producers, whether it's TV, film, directors, and could be film, TV again, executives, right? Those making decisions above the editorial side. And this could be a business decision that might influence the media content. But executives typically are the ones who make the big decisions. Program directors, right? That's a title given to someone running a radio station. Publishers who distribute books, journalists themselves, the reporters who are actually doing the research and publishing the information that we consume, and broadcasters who are verbally or visually disseminating that information. So these were the gatekeeper information before the internet emerged. Then the internet came, right? First it came as like disks you put in into your computer, which was called AOL. There was obviously URLs where people put in websites. Yahoo was one of the early websites that was really big. But social media did not emerge yet. There was a good 10 plus years there where the internet was strictly just websites and email. And that was really it, right? Like, you maybe had chat groups and you had instant messenger. So at this point, you had a couple new gatekeepers, right? You still have the same gatekeepers up here because all the other legacy media institutions still existed. But now you had web developers as a gatekeeper, right? Like if you knew how to design a web page, you are a gatekeeper. People are consuming your information and they're believing it or being influenced by it. That you suddenly had bloggers, right? That was a new title given to people who wrote shorter, abbreviated, oftentimes typically opinionated propagandic content. And to a lesser extent, you also had the commenters on websites. And this is what led to social media. You suddenly had news stories on a screen where at the bottom, you were allowed to give your own 2 cents on the story. So before, when a journalist would submit a piece, it would be published by a newspaper and that would be it. The journalist would move on, end of story, and what they wrote was truth. No one to dispute that. They were a hardcore gatekeeper of information. Now, all of a sudden, the journalist is publishing their content online, and you have comments underneath from anyone who had access and could register and sign up, maybe disputing the information, maybe adding new information. They suddenly became gatekeepers as well because people were being influenced and it was highly popular. And these executives noticed the popularity of being able to comment on websites. They noticed the popularity of engagement from the community. And that led to today. That led to the rise of social media, and that led to user-generated content. It is why in 2007, Times Person of the Year was you, because you, the citizen, the user, could now have a voice yourself, and you could produce digital content yourself. And it's led to what we have today. And there are a lot of good and bad things that go with that. We'll talk about that throughout this semester. This chart shows the rapid rise of social media and how quickly it's risen compared to other more traditional media platforms. So, for example, radio took 38 years to reach 50 million users worldwide. TV took 13 years to reach 50 million users worldwide. The iPod, I don't know if you folks remember those things, took 4 years to reach 50 million users worldwide. The internet itself took 3 years to reach 50 million users. Facebook only took 1 year, and Twitter only took 9 months. And my guess is TikTok probably took even way less than that. So you can see the trends and how fast social media has risen, especially in comparison to other more traditional forms of media. I'm going to finish up today's lecture by talking about media literacy, okay, which is a very important topic because so much of the information that is published out there simply is not true. But there are ways for you to determine and discern what is valid and what is not, right? So everything that's published online is not always correct, accurate, or true. Healthy skepticism, I talked about that a moment ago, is always recommended when reviewing content online, and that includes data, okay? Consider making a checklist for yourself as you go through the various sources and data. And that's where I through the help of my mentor back when I was in graduate school, she created this online credibility test, which can help you determine if the information you're consuming online is valid and trustworthy. And the online credibility test includes checking out the overall website, checking out the authorship of the website and the data that comes with it, the relevancy and currency of either the website and or the story you're consuming, and then the content itself. Right. And also, sorry, there's a fifth one here, the recognition of the site by others on the web. And that's very important as well. Like, are other individuals or organizations recognizing this content and using it themselves? And I'll go through each of these in just a second. So the first things first, the overall website itself. When you're looking at it, ask yourself this: what is the purpose of the site? If the purpose of the site is to persuade you to believe something, you might like it, it might entertain you, it might reinforce your own personal beliefs to make you feel better about yourself, but it might not necessarily be something trustworthy when it comes to actually consuming information. Whereas if the website is, let's say, a news site, and most of the stories are written in third person, most of the stories are written in reporting style, then maybe you're on the right track towards trusting the information, right? Ask yourself, does the website provide the information that you actually need? How is the grammar, spelling, and punctuation? In journalism, this is an acronym called GSP. If you're a journalism student, you're either familiar with this or you will be. And ask yourself, how's the GSP of this website? Are there a lot of grammatical mistakes? If there are, chances are you're consuming information from someone who's not educated, who has not been trained in journalism, and who is not a professional. That is not trustworthy content. And is the site well maintained? Like, are the hyperlinks going to other pages that actually work, or is it broken? If there are broken links, if there are a lot of grammatical mistakes, I'd take a pause and ask yourself if you should be trusting the content there. And there's the contributors, right? Like, who's actually like publishing and writing this content or verbalizing it if they're broadcasting? What can you tell about the author of the site? Like, do you know anything about him or her? What is the author's background, right? Can you determine that? Who's responsible for publishing the pages? This is very important because, for example, if a university system is publishing the information, chances are it's trustworthy. The most trustworthy sources of information are scholars, because everything they publish that goes into scholarly journals or academic journals goes through a peer review process where other scholars edit the content they submit, and the stories or the articles, are submitted anonymously. So there is no inherent bias in terms of the other 2 or 3 scholars, which is the average number, reviewing the content as they're going through it to check the validity of it, right? So the most trustworthy pieces of information in this world come from academics because A, they're experts in their field, and B, everything that is published by them is peer-reviewed and edited by other experts in the same field, and it's done so anonymously so that they don't know who the author of it is, thus removing that inherent bias that might be in there if they're familiar with the author of the academic article. And university websites here in the United States, and I believe this is globally as well, are allowed to purchase a domain with the suffix .edu. Okay, that's important because not anyone can buy a website with a .edu suffix. Only educational institutions can do that. So you can trust at a minimum that if the website ends in .edu, you know that that institution is who they say they are, right? Otherwise, there is no blue checkmark system like there is for Twitter or Instagram for websites. Same goes for government institutions. The US government is not allowed legally to publish falsified information. And government institutions are the only ones that can control a domain that ends in .gov. And there's also accountability with government institutions. So they are considered to be a trustworthy source of information. Again, because of the accountability, because of the legal aspect of it, where they legally have to publish objective content without misleading the audience. And then otherwise, if it's a commercial system or a news organization, I would definitely try and make sure they are who they say they are, because it is very easy for someone to mislead you by, for example, saying, hey, this is abc.com, except there is an abc.com.co out there too, right? There's like all sorts of misleading websites that sometimes slip through the cracks and show up, for example, on a news aggregator like Google News. So who is responsible for publishing the pages is an important part of the online credibility test. And then there's the content and the data within it, right? Based on your observation skills, can you tell if the content is biased or balanced, right? Who's the author of the content, and can you confirm that? Is there a way to contact someone about the content? That's where transparency is very important. Is there an email address? Is there any way you could actually respond and follow up? When was the content last updated, and how can you tell? If there's no date with the story, do not trust it. All right, that's a bad sign. Nearly every news organization makes sure to include a dateline of some sort with their stories. And is there any content missing? Because if that's a flag. If there's stuff that's important that's missing, then maybe the story you're reading is propaganda designed to try and persuade you to believe something or do something. And then the website recognition, right? Like, what do others think of the site? Like, in other words, if other professionals are referring to the site you're looking at, that's a good sign. If no one's ever heard of it, if you've never heard of it, or you barely know about it, I'd be a little skeptical at that point. Can you find referring URLs? Meaning, like, can you find other people who refer to that site you're looking at? Have other journalists used this site before? And that concludes, again, the online credibility test. So that is it for this week. Again, if you are in one of my classes, you most likely have a discussion post and 3 questions to answer. Make sure you do that. Reach out to me if you're a student of mine, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, that is it for this week, and I will see you all next week. Thank you.